Living rooms in the 1960s and 1970s were more than just places to sit. They were where families gathered, rules were quietly enforced, and everyday moments became lifelong memories. From furniture to small details no one questioned at the time, these spaces reflected a simpler way of living that shaped childhood in lasting ways. Plastic couch covers were a quiet symbol of how carefully living rooms were treated during the 1960s and 1970s. They were meant to protect furniture, but everyone remembers how they felt instead. On hot summer days, sitting down meant skin sticking instantly, followed by that unmistakable sound when you shifted even slightly. Children learned quickly to perch on the edge or place a towel underneath themselves to avoid discomfort. Parents insisted the covers stayed on because the couch was expensive and meant to last for years. Guests accepted them without question, knowing this was simply how homes were kept. Despite the discomfort, those plastic covers represented pride in ownership and a belief in preserving things rather than replacing them. Over time, the shine dulled, the edges cracked, but they remained in place, quietly guarding the furniture beneath. Long after summer ended, the covers stayed, reminding everyone that the living room was not a casual space. And sitting nearby, often within reach of those same couches, was another object that spoke volumes about daily habits and social norms. Heavy ashtrays were nearly impossible to ignore, even in homes where no one openly admitted to smoking. They sat solidly on coffee tables and end tables, made of thick glass or ceramic, sometimes decorative, sometimes purely practical. Children grew up seeing them as permanent fixtures, never questioning why they were there. Even when cigarettes were not lit, ashtrays remained, ready for guests, neighbors, or visiting relatives. They symbolized hospitality as much as habit, suggesting that someone might want one at any moment. Some were souvenirs from trips, others promotional items from local businesses, quietly anchoring the room. Kids were warned not to touch them because they were heavy enough to hurt if dropped. Over time, ashtrays became part of the background, blending into the room just like lamps and coasters. Their presence reflected an era when smoking was expected and accepted, woven into everyday life without discussion. And just beyond those tables, commanding attention and rearranging the entire room, stood the largest piece of furniture in the house. The console television was not just an appliance, it was the centerpiece of the living room. Built into large wooden cabinets, it looked more like furniture than technology. Families arranged couches and chairs around it, treating it as a focal point for evenings and special events. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, while adults claimed seats farther back, creating an unspoken hierarchy of viewing spots. The television stayed in one place for years, sometimes decades, because moving it was nearly impossible. Its top often held framed photographs, decorative items, or even houseplants, blending it into the room's design. Turning it on felt intentional, accompanied by a soft hum and the glow of the screen slowly appearing. Watching television became a shared experience, something done together rather than alone. When the set was off, it still dominated the space, reminding everyone where attention would soon return. Draped nearby, adding warmth and texture, were blankets that served both comfort and decoration. Crocheted or knitted throw blankets were carefully placed rather than casually tossed. They often rested across the back of the couch or folded neatly over an arm, adding color and softness to the room. Many were handmade by relatives, making them feel special even if they were rarely used. Children were sometimes told not to touch them, while others were allowed only during colder months. The texture was unmistakable, slightly rough yet comforting, with patterns that felt familiar and timeless. These blankets were part decoration, part utility, blending function with pride. They softened the look of plastic-covered couches and added warmth to darker rooms filled with wood paneling. Over the years, they absorbed memories of quiet evenings, family conversations, and long winters. Even when unused, they contributed to the feeling that the room was complete, and when summer heat became overwhelming, comfort came not from blankets, but from another essential piece quietly humming in the corner. A large standing fan was carefully positioned to control the air in the room. Before central air conditioning became common, fans were essential tools for surviving hot summers. Families angled them just right, experimenting until the airflow reached the couch or favorite chair. The fan often stayed in one spot all season, becoming part of the room's layout. Children remember the steady hum and the temptation to place their hands in front of the moving air. Parents reminded everyone not to get too close, treating the fan with caution and respect. At night, its sound blended with quiet conversations and ticking clocks, creating a familiar backdrop. The fan did not cool the room completely, but it made the heat bearable. It represented simple solutions and shared discomfort, accepted without complaint. And near that fan, often illuminated softly in the evening, stood another familiar object that helped define how the room felt after sunset. Wood-paneled walls gave living rooms in the 1960s and 1970s a feeling that was both cozy and heavy at the same time. The dark tones absorbed light, making rooms feel warmer but also smaller, especially in the evening. Families rarely questioned the style because it felt modern, solid, and grown up. Children remember running their fingers along the grooves, feeling the texture, without thinking about design. The paneling made the room feel serious, like a place where rules applied and voices stayed calm. Lamps cast soft pools of light that barely reached the corners, reinforcing the sense that this was a room meant for sitting rather than moving. Over time, the walls witnessed countless conversations, holidays, and quiet evenings. Even when tastes changed, the paneling stayed, because removing it felt unnecessary and expensive. It became part of the home's identity, shaping how the space felt long after it stopped being fashionable. And resting against those walls, holding items meant for reading and display, were small pieces of furniture that served both form and function. End tables with built-in magazine racks were subtle but essential parts of the living room. They held newspapers, catalogs, and magazines that everyone flipped through, but no one threw away. The racks stayed full, sometimes overflowing, creating a quiet archive of everyday life. Children remember seeing familiar covers month after month, learning to recognize favorite magazines before they could read. Adults treated the stacks as current even when the dates passed, because information moved slower then. The tables also held lamps, drinks, and remote controls, making them central to daily routines. Reaching down to pull out a magazine became a natural habit during commercials or quiet moments. These tables were not decorative alone. They were practical, built to support time spent sitting together. Over the years, the paper yellowed, corners curled, but the racks remained filled. And beside those tables, stretching across the room and tangling easily, was a household object that connected everyone to the outside world. The telephone with an extra long, curly cord was a lifeline that tied the living room together. It allowed conversations to stretch across the space, letting people pace, sit, or lean against furniture while talking. Children learned quickly how far the cord could reach without pulling it from the wall. Privacy was limited, and everyone could hear at least part of every call. The sound of the ringing phone brought immediate attention, stopping conversations and drawing everyone closer. Parents answered with purpose, while kids listened quietly, waiting to hear if the call was for them. The cord twisted over time, forming tight spirals that never quite straightened again. Calls were shorter, deliberate, and meaningful, because no one wanted to block access for too long. The phone belonged in the living room because that was where life happened. Draped nearby, adding another layer of protection and decoration, were small fabric details placed with care. Decorative doilies were carefully positioned on couch arms and headrests, protecting furniture while adding a touch of elegance. They were often handmade or passed down, making them feel important even if no one talked about them. Children were taught not to move them, learning early that certain things stayed exactly where they were placed. The lace patterns softened the look of heavy furniture, adding brightness to darker rooms. Doilies also served a practical purpose, shielding fabric from wear and keeping everything looking neat. They stayed in place through seasons and years, quietly collecting dust and memories. Even when the rest of the room changed, the doilies remained, a symbol of order and tradition. Their presence suggested that the living room was meant to be respected, not treated casually. And nearby, providing sound, music, and a sense of occasion, stood another piece of furniture that turned listening into an event. The record player, set up like a piece of fine furniture, brought music into the living room with intention and care. Built into wooden cabinets, these players looked like elegant sideboards rather than devices. Families gathered around them to listen together, flipping records slowly and gently. Children learned not to touch the needle, understanding that one mistake could ruin a favorite album. Playing music required effort, from selecting a record to placing it correctly, making each song feel earned. The sound filled the room, warm and rich, shaping moods and memories. Records were stored neatly inside, becoming a part of the furniture itself. When not in use, the player remained closed, blending into the room. Music was not background noise, it was an activity. And as those records spun, another familiar object nearby quietly tracked time, marking moments between songs and conversations. Framed family photos that never changed for years were quiet anchors of the living room. They showed frozen moments that became permanent, even as the people in them grew older. School portraits, wedding photos, and formal poses sat side by side, often arranged once and never touched again. Children grew up seeing younger versions of themselves every day, without thinking much about it. Guests noticed them immediately, while family members barely glanced at them anymore. The frames gathered dust, the colors slowly faded, but no one considered replacing them. Updating photos felt unnecessary, almost wrong, as if changing them would disrupt the balance of the room. These pictures were not decoration as much as proof of family, continuity, and belonging. They reminded everyone who lived there and who mattered. And when evening came and the light shifted, those photos were often illuminated by another familiar source that shaped the mood of the room. Floor lamps with large fabric shades provided soft light that never felt harsh. They stood beside couches or tucked into corners, casting a warm glow that filled the room slowly. Turning one on felt like settling in for the night. The shades muted brightness, making conversations quieter and television watching calmer. Children remember accidentally brushing against them and being warned not to knock them over. The lamps rarely moved, becoming part of the room's permanent layout. Their light softened wood paneling and made long evenings feel comfortable. Even when overhead lights existed, these lamps were preferred, creating a sense of calm and routine. As shadows stretched across the room, attention often shifted toward the center, where another familiar surface quietly collected everyday items. A coffee table covered in coasters that were never used was a familiar contradiction. The coasters were arranged neatly, sometimes stacked, sometimes spread out as decoration. Everyone knew they were there to protect the table, yet drinks were almost always placed beside them instead. Children were told to use them, then quickly forgot. Over time, rings appeared anyway, blending into the table's surface. The coasters remained untouched, more symbolic than practical. They represented good intentions and house rules that were rarely enforced. The table itself became a gathering place for snacks, mail, and conversation. And near that table, there was always one seat that carried special authority. One chair everyone knew belonged to Dad held an unspoken rule. It was positioned just right, often facing the television, and no one questioned who it was for. Children avoided sitting there unless invited, understanding its importance without explanation. The chair showed wear in familiar places, shaped by years of use. When Dad was not home, The chair stayed empty, waiting. It was a symbol of routine, comfort, and quiet leadership within the household. And nearby, stored neatly but ready when needed, were tools that turned television time into an event. Fold-out television trays stored behind the couch appeared whenever dinner moved into the living room. They unfolded with a familiar motion, legs locking into place as children rushed to claim one. Meals eaten on trays felt special, even if the food was ordinary. When not in use, they disappeared behind the couch, leaning quietly until needed again. They represented flexibility, comfort, and the small excitement of breaking routine. And as those trays came out, another detail of the living room quietly shaped how evenings unfolded. A decorative bowl that always held candy or loose change sat quietly on a coffee table or end table, never empty for long. Children checked it often, hoping to find wrapped sweets left behind from holidays or a few coins that felt like treasure. Adults rarely noticed when the contents changed, yet somehow the bowl was always refilled. The candy became sticky in warm months, wrappers curling at the edges, while loose change collected slowly over time. It was not meant to be practical, but it served a purpose everyone understood. The bowl became a small reward system, a place where good behavior might be quietly rewarded. Even when empty, it stayed right where it was, part of the room's rhythm. And surrounding that small bowl, larger patterns worked together to define the look of the entire space. Matching curtains and sofa patterns made the living room feel carefully planned and complete. The fabrics repeated the same colors and designs, tying everything together in a way that felt intentional and grown up. Children noticed the patterns without understanding why they mattered. Parents took pride in how the room looked when everything matched. The curtains framed the windows, softening daylight, while the sofa anchored the room visually. Even when styles changed, the matching sets stayed for years because replacing them felt unnecessary. The room felt finished, even if nothing else was added. And when the lights dimmed and everyone settled in, another constant made itself known through sound rather than sight. A wall clock that ticked loud enough to hear at night became part of the living room's background. During the day, it went unnoticed, but in the quiet hours, its steady ticking filled the space. Children lying on the couch or floor counted the ticks without meaning to. The clock marked time without flashing or glowing, simply doing its job. It reminded everyone when it was time to go to bed, when a show was ending, or when someone was late. The sound became comforting, a sign that the house was still awake, even when everyone was quiet. And as that ticking continued, it set the pace for countless evenings spent together in the living room. Bookshelves filled with encyclopedias no one opened were a quiet symbol of pride in many living rooms during the 1960s and 1970s. The volumes stood tall and uniform, their spines neatly aligned, often stretching across an entire shelf. Parents spoke of them with respect, treating the set as an investment in knowledge and a sign of doing right by the family. Children were told they could use them for schoolwork, yet rarely did. Instead, the encyclopedias became background furniture, glanced at but seldom touched. Even when homework questions came up, asking an adult felt easier than pulling down a heavy volume. Over time, the information inside became outdated, but no one suggested getting rid of them. They stayed because they represented effort, aspiration, and a belief in learning that mattered, even when unused. Dust gathered on the tops, but the books remained in place, untouched and unquestioned. And resting nearby on couches and chairs, adding softness but carrying their own strict rules, were another familiar detail of the living room. Decorative pillows that were not allowed to be used sat perfectly arranged, often fluffed and positioned just right. They added color and balance to couches and chairs, completing the look of the room. Children learned early that these pillows were not for leaning on, sleeping with, or playing around. They were decoration only, and touching them usually resulted in a quiet correction. The pillows stayed pristine, rarely showing wear, because they served appearance rather than comfort. Guests noticed them, admired them, but often hesitated before moving them aside. They represented order and presentation, reinforcing the idea that the living room was not meant for chaos. Even during long evenings, the pillows remained untouched, silently doing their job, and tucked away nearby, holding tools for another kind of care and creativity, was an object that blended usefulness with tradition. A sewing basket tucked into a corner was both practical and reassuring. It held spools of thread, needles, buttons, and scraps of fabric, all collected over time. Children knew it was there, but were warned not to open it without permission. The basket symbolized readiness, the idea that torn clothes could be fixed rather than thrown away. It often came out quietly during conversations or television watching, hands moving automatically while voices continued. Mending was not treated as a chore, but as part of normal life. The basket returned to its corner when finished, waiting patiently for the next need. It reflected an era when things were cared for, not replaced. And as seasons changed, another tradition quietly lingered far longer than expected. Holiday decorations that stayed up far too long were a familiar sight in many living rooms. A string of lights, a wreath, or a small decoration remained weeks after the holiday passed. No one rushed to take them down because life moved slower and the decorations still felt comforting. Children stopped noticing them, while adults accepted their presence without comment. The decorations blended into the room, becoming part of the everyday setting. Taking them down felt unnecessary until much later, when someone finally noticed the season had truly changed. Their lingering presence stretched the feeling of celebration just a little longer, and as those decorations faded into the background, they marked the end of another chapter of living room traditions shaped by time, habit, and shared memory. A cabinet displaying souvenirs from family trips was like a quiet timeline of shared experiences. Inside glass doors sat small objects collected over years, each one tied to a memory, even if no one talked about it anymore. There might be miniature landmarks, postcards standing upright, seashells, or small figurines bought at roadside stops. Children remembered watching parents carefully place each new item inside, deciding where it belonged. The cabinet was not meant to be touched, only looked at, and opening it usually required permission. Guests paused in front of it, asking questions that brought old stories back to life. For the family, the cabinet blended into the room, its contents becoming familiar shapes rather than destinations. Yet it quietly reminded everyone that they had been places, done things, and shared time together. Even when travel slowed or stopped, the cabinet stayed full, preserving moments that otherwise might have been forgotten. And beneath that cabinet, covering the floor and absorbing years of everyday life, was another detail that proved just how much the living room was meant to be lived in. Carpet patterns that hid every spill were a practical blessing disguised as decoration. The designs were busy, layered with colors and shapes that made stains nearly invisible. Children spilled drinks, dropped snacks, and tracked in dirt without immediate panic, because the carpet forgave almost everything. Parents still scolded, but there was comfort in knowing the evidence would not linger. The carpet softened footsteps, muffled sound, and made sitting on the floor feel normal. Over time, it absorbed the weight of furniture, leaving marks that stayed even when things were moved. Vacuum lines became temporary order in a surface that already carried years of wear. The patterns aged quietly, hiding not just spills, but memories of everyday life. When styles changed, the carpet often remained, because it still worked. And as families moved on, those carpets became one of the last silent witnesses to a living room that once held countless ordinary and unforgettable moments. A small stack of mail and newspapers on the table was a constant presence in the living room, quietly updating itself every day. Letters, bills, store flyers, and folded newspapers piled up in the same spot, rarely sorted right away. Children recognized envelopes by color and size, knowing which ones were important and which could be ignored. Adults flipped through newspapers slowly, sometimes rereading the same sections for days. The stack was not clutter, it was routine, proof that the household was active and connected to the outside world. Even when outdated, the papers stayed, because information moved at a calmer pace. The table became a place where news was absorbed, discussed, or quietly set aside. And when evening came and the light grew softer, another familiar object helped shift the room from daytime activity to nighttime calm. Lamps with pull chains instead of switches were simple, but deeply satisfying to use. Turning them on required a small, deliberate motion, the soft click marking the change from bright day to relaxed evening. Children loved pulling the chain, often doing it twice just to hear the sound again, until reminded not to play with it. The chain sometimes tangled or broke, yet the lamp stayed, repaired or adjusted rather than replaced. These lamps gave control over light in a personal way, allowing each corner of the room to glow just enough. Their warm light encouraged quieter voices and slower movement. Over time, the action of pulling the chain became automatic, part of settling in, and once the lights were just right, attention often turned to planning what to watch next. A television guide booklet left open to the week's schedule was a quiet promise of what was coming. It lay open on a table or armrest, pages folded back to favorite nights. Families planned evenings around it, circling shows mentally and adjusting routines to be ready on time. Children studied it closely, learning days of the week through programs they loved. The booklet was consulted often, then left exactly where it was, open and waiting. It represented anticipation because missing a show meant waiting an entire week. And as those pages stayed open, they marked the rhythm of evenings shaped by shared viewing and simple expectations. Plastic plants that never gathered dust somehow were a quiet mystery in many living rooms during the 1960s and 1970s. They sat on end tables, shelves, or near windows, forever green and unchanged. No one remembered buying them, yet they were always there, blending into the room as if they belonged naturally. Children brushed past them while playing, sometimes touching the stiff leaves and feeling the strange texture that never quite felt real. Parents liked them because they required no care, no watering, and no attention. They added color without responsibility. Even as the rest of the room aged, the plants stayed exactly the same, untouched by seasons or time. Dust settled everywhere else, yet these plants seemed immune, wiped down occasionally, or simply ignored. They symbolized a desire for beauty that did not demand effort, fitting perfectly into a room built for order and longevity. And as those plants stood frozen in place, everything else in the room was arranged with one priority that overruled all others. Furniture arranged around the television, no matter what, defined the true purpose of the living room. Couches, chairs, and tables were positioned to face the screen, even if it made conversation awkward. Comfort was secondary to visibility. Children learned quickly which spots had the best view and claimed them early. Adults accepted stiff angles and blocked pathways because missing part of the screen was not an option. The television dictated the layout, turning the room into a shared viewing space rather than a flexible one. Even when the television was off, the furniture stayed, waiting for the next program. Rearranging it rarely crossed anyone's mind. The room existed to support watching together, quietly and attentively. And during those moments of shared focus, another rule shaped behavior just as strongly as the furniture itself. The unspoken rule to sit quietly when adults were talking was understood without explanation. Children sensed it the moment voices lowered and conversations became serious. They stayed still, listened without interrupting, and waited patiently. Speaking out of turn brought immediate looks or gentle reminders. The living room became a place of observation, where children learned how adults spoke, paused, and decided things. Silence was not uncomfortable. It was expected. Sitting quietly felt like a sign of growing up, of being trusted to behave. Even boredom was accepted as part of the experience. This rule shaped manners, patience, and awareness, all without being written or enforced loudly. It was simply how things were done. And together, these quiet rules and familiar objects formed a living room that taught lessons long after childhood ended. These living rooms were not just spaces filled with furniture and objects. They were places where habits formed, rules were learned, and memories quietly settled in over time. If any of these details brought you back, share what your living room looked like in the comments. Tap the like button to keep the memories alive, and subscribe so you do not miss the next walk through everyday life from another era.